after this. So for those of you folks that were with us yesterday for the panel on standardizing Atlassian, you may already know Dave. He's our JIRA admin at Symantec, and quite an experienced guy, and he's going to tell you a little bit about how to get through to your executives when it comes to deploying our products. Coming up. Thanks, Ken.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Second to last session of the summit. I know you're all thinking about either a drink or a nap at this point, so thanks for sitting down with me. My name's Dave Sokolowski. I work at Symantec Corporation, a world leader in security software. And I've worked for Symantec for about 6.5 years. And over those years, I've always been involved with the online store. And right now, our online store, which is called eBusiness, through a recent reorg, is now responsible for the entire online experience that you have. So everything from Symantec.com, Norton.com, through buy.norton.com, through the pricing and fulfillment and all of the shopping cart and all of the stores. And through these years, and I'll elaborate on my story later, but through these years I've had a lot of opportunities to talk with executives about the Atlassian tools, whether they're coming down and asking, what the hell are you doing down here? Or whether I have to go and make a request up. And I'd like to share some of my stories and my interactions with some of those executives and hopefully give you some tools that you can use if you have that opportunity. So I talked through my introduction. I'll talk through these tools briefly for talking with executives. And then I will share my own case study as I became a JIRA admin, where our JIRA instance came from, and how we've scaled it up to today. I have about 2,000 users with about 80,000 issues. And I'm looking at some scaling issues in the near to distant future. But most important is, along this journey, the experiences that I've had in talking with executives, I hope that I can share with you. And I'll answer some questions. But first, group hug. I love coming to Atlassian Summit. I love it here so much. I had such a great time yesterday meeting people, just chatting. You just stepping in line with someone and you're like, hey, what do you do? Oh, I'm a JIRA admin. Well, I'm a JIRA admin too. And so much fun to actually sit around and talk with people who get the day-to-day problems that we all have. You can talk about crazy stuff. You can talk about issue types, screen schemes, workflow schemes, API calls, project roles, blah, 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 blah. And I can guarantee that 99% of the people that you work with do not care at all about these sorts of things. So I love coming to Summit. You guys are my audience, and just the level of interaction, the people, what we do here is just a really, really great thing. So this is how I see all of you collectively. I know that we've got lots of shapes and colors of people, but when I think about JIRA admins, when I think about Atlassian administrators, whether it's Confluence or developers or all this, I see you guys down in the weeds, down in the details, really getting into it, really enjoying just at the bottom level, making stuff run. And so I can talk with you about this stuff and we can converse about this stuff all day long. These folks, though, not so much. When you go and you talk to an executive, perhaps someone with a director in their title or a president, so director, senior director, vice president, senior vice president, group president, executive vice president, CIO, CEO. If you're going to go and you're going to talk with these people about the tools and how they can make people's lives better, you cannot use the same language that we all use day to day here. You're going to have to come up with a new method for working upwards. So today I'm going to talk about some tools, and not the same type of tools that we all love, Confluence and JIRA and Agile and all of these things. I'm going to give you 3 tools that you can use that you internalize for yourself. These aren't tools, I can't actually pass something out. These are things that are learned. These are things that as you go through your day-to-day, as you think about, hey, there's a new senior vice president on board. How am I going to have a conversation with that person? These are things that you should be able to work on your own and begin telling your own story, which I'll get into, and begin putting together these pieces so that if and when that day comes, that you have something to say. The first tool is knowing your audience. So I'm here at Summit. I feel like I know most of you, at least by heart. You know, we suffer the same challenges and we have the same issues and regrets. But when you go and you talk to an executive, you need to know what that audience is, who that audience is. Is it one person who you're going to be talking to? Is it a group of executives? Is it a senior staff meeting? Is it a board of directors? What is that group about? Who are they, and what do they want out of things? Because they don't want the same things that you and I do. If you have, say, a senior director of program management, she might want something entirely different than, say, a senior vice president of the overall business. They're going to be looking at things like return on investment, operational efficiencies. They're going to know what's the throughput rate on their teams, the operation teams. How quickly are these teams executing? How quickly are you solving your customers' problems? They're going to want to be able to talk about things at a higher level. And so going and identifying your audience ahead of time is really, really critical. I'll talk a little bit about my own experience, but some of the things you can think about when you're looking and you're meeting your audience. Probably the best way to find out what they want is to actually go ask them. If you're lucky enough to have an executive with an open door policy, a lot of executives are actually really friendly people, and if you can find the time to go and meet them face to face, then that's a really great opportunity just to get some time with them and find out what makes them tick and what they're doing. But executives are busy people as well. They don't really always have time just to sit down and chat about what their goals are. There are a couple of other avenues that you can take. You can ask questions. You can find out who else they've worked with and worked for. What sort of things make them tick? What sort of personality are they? Are they really super driven, results driven people? Or are they more interested in harmony among the business line? And if nothing else, you can just go and do some research online, whether it's LinkedIn or just trying to find out what sort of businesses they've been involved with, what sort of issues that they've faced in their history, and try to glean something from them. So being able to understand what their needs are is perhaps the most critical component. The second tool is owning your data, and I'll give you a second here to read my Star Wars joke, data joke, no less. My point here is that I can make a Star Wars joke, and hopefully most of you will get this about Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's a data joke, though, and it tells you, I brought it here because I thought that some or most of you would find a Star Wars joke based on data funny. The idea with owning your data, though, is it's not just enough to go and find out velocity burn down charts, what the overall cost of the solutions are, what's the return on investment. It's not enough just to have some raw data and put it up on a slide. You need to own your data. You need to be able to be the one who's going to wrap context around that data. If you come into a meeting with some executives and you're going to tell them how much life is going to be better with the Atlassian tool set, you better be able to tell them how. What's the context for that data? How does it fit into what they need? Because again, you've done your research and you've understood what they're looking for. And I'll talk a little bit about my own challenges in finding data that I can contextualize for my executives. But finally, and perhaps the most critical component of all of this, is telling a story. And that's what I'm here today to do. I'm here to tell you a story, tell you my own story, my own journey, my own experience with executives. But all of you have your own stories and your own challenges. And we hear a lot about learning how to tell stories these days, a lot of presentation trainings about telling stories and the like. And I think the important thing to glean from that is that a story helps ground the past in something tangible in the now. You're providing some sort of emotional connection to people. You're giving them something to hang some trouble or some question that they have on an experience that someone else has had. So whether if you're talking about something that's happened in the past or something that's happened in the future, if you're talking with an executive and you can give them a story, if you can give them a method for visualizing in their head what it is that you're talking about, if you can give them real people and real challenges that have either been overcome or that you're working to overcome, if you can wrap that around a story, that is really the most critical component to how you're going to engage. You run into a lot of executives who are not very technical. And as I made the point on the previous slide, getting into how many API calls or how many JIRA issues or whatever all of that down-to-earth details that we all love, that it's just going to go over their head. Their eyes are going to glaze over, and you've lost them immediately. So telling a story, whether it's an individual Scrum team's growth, or whether it's the ability for you to address upcoming challenges, if you can put an executive in a place where they can see their end users, or they can see their teams, or even if they can see their executives, their bosses, if they can see in their mind how it's going to work, then that is really the critical part. It's a critical tool. One thing I'd also like to say about telling your story, I'm up here today speaking with you. I've been a member of Toastmasters International for about 9 months. It's not a tool for speaking to executives, it's a tool for everybody, all the time. And I have to say that the reason I started taking Toastmasters is because I wanted to come up here right now and speak to you all. And I cannot recommend Toastmasters International enough to anybody. It's one of the best skills. The confidence and the ability to engage with people and speak with people is one of the most critical skills you will ever have in your business at all. Toastmasters International are all across the board. You can go to the website and you can look for a club. I can't recommend it enough. It's a great component to build your profession. So let's go back to the beginning. We moved our external e-commerce platform. We pulled it in from a third party at Symantec, and we built out our own e-commerce platform internally. And it was just racing at breakneck speed. We were moving so fast. No one was really clear about roles and responsibilities and these sorts of things. And I ended up managing the SharePoint instance. And we were using the SharePoint instance for operation requests, so we were actually using the workflows within SharePoint. It wasn't very easy to maintain. User management was enough trouble to keep all of our days occupied. Things in the e-commerce organization moved very, very fast. And quickly we got to a place where I teamed up with the QA director. And we began talking about how we could expand that use. And I put the picture of the chaos theory up here. I'm sorry if I want to offend any quantum physicists in the room. This is actually the beautiful side of the chaos theory. The idea being that there were so many iterations and so many changes within e-commerce going on, there was no way to track. You couldn't set anything in stone day to day because the business was moving so fast, it was growing so fast. People were changing their roles all the time. There was no one way to put a lead on what was happening. We just couldn't keep up with the operational overhead. So I had SharePoint, and a QA director had Bugzilla that we had both been giving these tools to manage from an external vendor. But we were now in the position to be able to own these tools ourselves. And we looked at what we were doing with Bugzilla and what we were doing with SharePoint, and it just wasn't scalable. He didn't like Bugzilla, and that was his. So he brought in this tool I had never heard of before. JIRA, is that what it's called? JIRA? He brought in JIRA, and he quickly migrated out of Bugzilla. And we had some long conversations about how to begin bringing in the operations side of what we were doing. How could we mix the two? And JIRA was very, very quickly, we were quickly able to adapt to it. We were able to get things up and running. And we actually found ourselves, I hired a JIRA admin. I had some experience with JIRA, and I took some trainings. And I was more of the front project manager of trying to address people's needs. But I hired a JIRA admin. This is a few years ago. I actually stole a support engineer from Atlassian, which I highly recommend if you're able to do that. It's supposed to be a little bit harder now. And my previous guy, he's actually circled back around. He works back at Atlassian now. But the two of us, we worked to build out some workflows and begin getting the business what they wanted. They were just so lost in trying to track their work. How do we track our work? What are we doing here? Time went by, and we built out a couple key workflows. And then my JIRA admin left. He moved on. And so I was alone in the desert. I was responsible for now a JIRA instance. People were starting to use it a lot more. And I really wanted to legitimize it. It was stuck in a web dev server out in the data center that was supposed to be decommissioned, though no one knew when. And I really had nothing to hang on. And that was actually when I came to my first summit back in 2010. And I came back and I was just like, oh, the collaboration tools, it solves all your problems. So you just need JIRA and Confluence and Greenhopper, and you just turn them all on and it'll solve all of your problems. Easy, right? I mean, that's all you have to do, just like that. Of course, it's not that simple, but I worked really hard, and I just wished for an opportunity that I could have to where I could get up in front of executives and talk. And I didn't really have an idea of some tools. I didn't know about owning my data or understanding my audience or anything like that. But I had a little bit of a story. And so I went looking for some data. I said, I need to have something to hang this on. And I can come up with how many users we have and how many issues we have. I mean, to my point, to an executive, it's not really that interesting, and I couldn't really find anything to hang that on. And this is where I first got into the idea of contextualizing your data, owning your data. I came up with one number that I knew that would hook in and that would at least get me in the door. And that number is $1.8 billion. This is the number that, back a couple years ago, our senior vice president was responsible for making on an annual basis for his online store. And he was running his business on JIRA, his $1.8 billion business on JIRA, and he was running on a dev box that was going to be decommissioned. And he didn't know that. And so I put together some slides. This was the first slide in my slide deck. This is the Apollo 13 project team. You want to talk about people who know how to collaborate. These guys know how to collaborate. They know how to send people into space. And so I had these grand plans for this speech that I was going to give to the senior staff. I just was going to go in there, start with this slide, and just tell this great story, these collaboration tools, and how they'll just solve all the problems in the world. This is before I joined Toastmasters, before I understood how to tell your story, before I understood any of those things. I had a couple ideas, but I got up there in front of the group, and I choked. This is the international symbol for choking. I got to that first slide and my mind went blank. And I had no idea what to talk to. I was stuck in the headlights. And quite frankly, I just lost track completely. This may be the international symbol for choking, but really this is how I felt. And it's not to say that our senior vice president was actually choking me, but this was the scale at which I thought I had crashed and burned. And in one fleeting instance, I sort of blurted out again, you're running your $1.8 billion business on a dev box that's supposed to be decommissioned. And the senior vice president, he's a smart guy, and he threw me a lifeline. He said, okay, I think I hear what you're saying. You don't have a lot of data, and you certainly don't know what I need out of this conversation, and your story's pretty good, but yeah, you've hooked me with your data. You've given me something I can sink my teeth in. Why don't you go out and legitimize the JIRA instance? Why don't you go figure out how to make it legitimate? And so I did that. Flash forward 6 months. We got our JIRA instance hosted at Rackspace, and now we're humming along, and we're using it. There are more issues, there are more workflows. And I get a new boss. She's actually, this is something to watch for. She was a senior director who took a step down to become a director. So she's sort of working under the guise of being less than she really is. Very, very bright woman. I was really lucky to work for her for a couple of years. And it was time to operationalize the organization. It was time to take operations and bring something to the next level. And she said, what are you going to do for me? How can you do this? We need to get 2 Scrum teams up and running. We need to get the operations teams. We need to get simple intakes for all of those teams. What can you do for me? How can you help me? What's this JIRA tool I keep hearing all about? Well, I knew from who she was, and I was fortunate enough to be able to talk to her, I knew that she needed some quick wins. She was new to the organization, really bright. She had taken basically a demotion to get into the organization. So I knew she needed to get some quick wins. And what we began discussing is how do we operationalize the organization around JIRA? How do we use JIRA to solve her problems, which were ease of use, metrics, just do it, and prioritization. What do all these mean? Well, once I was able to break down what she was looking for, it was very easy to tie in for her and create a message for her that she could quickly see. She's an incredibly visual woman who could not deal with words on a slide at all. She really liked to see clear lines and bubbles and that sort of thing. So it was really easy for me once I could pick out what she needed, and a lot of that was just asking her. I was fortunate enough to work directly for her. But she had no experience with JIRA. She didn't know what the heck JIRA was about. What's JIRA about? Ease of use. She wanted her customers to be able to jump in and be able to quickly isolate where to make a request. Well, this goes back again to knowing my audience. I knew that she was, as a director of operations, a new sort of operations management team, I knew that she was looking for a way to help her boss, the senior vice president, get things moving faster. That's all he ever wanted to do, is just get things moving faster. Come on, it's not going fast enough. It's not going fast enough. So we needed a quick way to do that. Well, having a single JIRA project for multiple different types of requests is perhaps not the most elegant way of doing it. But man, it made it easy for all of the sales and marketing folks to make their requests. They could jump in and they could see what they needed quickly and easily. Metrics, we need to see what's the throughput rate. Well, we just help define those up front. Here's the thing when you're putting together a new workflow or a new project, make sure the customer defines their metrics up front. Ask them, what are you going to be tracking once we're done? Are you looking for SLAs? Are you looking for how many bugs you're tracking and how often they are, how long they're sitting around for? Asking your customer up front what they're going to be using the tools for is a really quick way to deliver on their expectations. Just do it. The team needed to be able to get past the idea that every single piece of work requires approval. Can we just give the operations teams these things that they can just do? They just can do them and you can hand a request. And we defined those just do it's very simply using components. So when we used components, not only did it have the auto assign issue, but it made it very, very easy for the customer to go in and make those requests, those just do it's, and see what they wanted to get. A very elegant solution that made my director's eyes light up. But the key was Greenhopper, Agile now. The key was Greenhopper. They worked through the process for a little while and they were doing okay, things were okay, and they came back to me and they were kind of freaked out. They said, look, we've got all of these requests. Now we turned on the machine, it works really well. They've got all these requests coming through the system. We don't know what to do with them. There's so many, we don't know how to prioritize. So what we've been doing is, of course, exporting to Excel and kind of trying to pick our way through what the priorities are. And my key win here, understanding how they needed something simple and elegant to use. We didn't actually really even use, we had Scrum teams, but we weren't using the rapid boards yet. But what we did, I just showed them this. This is the classic board. It didn't look like this at the time quite. But you can go and drag and drop, that you can pull a filter, and you can prioritize using global rank. Blew their minds. They could do this, it's real time. People bring in new requests, they show up at the bottom, and every week right before the Scrum team meets, the business would go in and prioritize all of their requests using Greenhopper. Very easy and elegant to use. It blew their minds that they no longer had to use Excel for this, and then they could get a real-time picture of all of the requests. They loved it. And that was a really key win for me. Being able to contextualize this data, their data, to be able to tell a story. Hey, your regional director is now going to be able to just go in and prioritize their stuff really quickly. Really sunk in with the team of executives that I was working with. So time moves on, another year. Things are running well, actually. So well, of course, success breeds success, and of course the reward for good work is more work. So we came to a place where now we had our JIRA instance up and it was moving along. We have our operations teams and our Scrum teams and everyone's doing a really great job in using it. And now comes a point where we have some new executives. And we need to start looking at portfolio management. We need to start understanding a larger scale questions. It's not just about the little just do it's in the Scrum teams. It's talking about strategic projects and product launches. How do we manage those larger scale questions across the board? We had a new vice president, not our vice president, Joe Biden, I'm sure who's having an interesting day today, but a new vice president. And when you get a new vice president, they're always going to come in and they're always going to have their own agenda. And what I did with this vice president was, he was very friendly and very open. I worked to find out what he was being asked for again. just try to understand what his challenges are. I was going to be working with my boss, who had now been promoted to a senior director, so senior director of program management. She's going to be responsible for things like making sure the process is run. She's got program managers and scrum masters. She doesn't really care about operational metrics. What she wants to know is, are her customers happy? Is she in a place where the processes are moving swiftly and cleanly enough that that JIRA is not the bottleneck at any point? Can people get into the request process easily and quickly? That was really what she was interested in. Another director got promoted to basically the director of the customer experience, so he was in charge of all the operations teams. He's not so worried about what everybody else is doing. What he wants to make sure is that his team is working hard. Ex-military guy, ex-operations guy, he just cracks the whip. So he wants to see all of his metrics. He wants to see what's the burn down rate. He wants to see how many tickets these folks are completing and how quickly they're completing. Okay, so filters and dashboards, those are really good. Unblocking things from workflows so that maybe tweak the statuses a little bit. But our new vice president had an idea, and he wanted us to get a new portfolio management tool. And if you have an experience with going and scoping out portfolio management tools, they're actually quite expensive, considerably more expensive than JIRA. And they take a long time to implement. So now you're looking at $500,000 in 12 months to implement. And I could see it coming because they're talking about it, and I'm sitting next to my boss's office and I'm in conversations. And if you're lucky enough and you keep your ears open, if you're in the right meetings, you can kind of tell when the political banner swings in a different direction. And I could tell that I was waiting for the conversation about whether JIRA could fulfill their needs. They were doing it properly. They were looking at the people side and the process side, and not looking at the technology yet. That's the best way to do it. Check out what the people's needs are, what are the processes that the people need to support it, and then figure out what's the tool that supports it. But I know that the tool, there really were only two choices. One is use JIRA, which isn't a portfolio management tool, or go and find a portfolio management tool. And the day came, and they decided to come to me, and they needed to know whether JIRA could do the job for them. So for one, I knew my audience. I had worked with them enough, and I had become familiar enough with their needs and their objectives. I had a handful of executives who were looking to me to solve their problem. As far as owning the data, the key point was that I was using was just running off of the users and whether they were happy. But how I contextualized that in itself was to bring up some dashboards, to talk through the dashboards. If they were ever asking whether people were working or not, you could look at the dashboards. But more important was we had a JIRA instance. It's already running, our cost is already absorbed, everything's already running. The data is, are you going to work with what you have with JIRA, or are you going to go spend $500,000 in 12 months and go bring a portfolio management tool in? And I can see my boss sort of leaning back in her chair. I'm sitting here, and she's thinking, I know she's mulling this over, and she's like, oh, what could I do, what could I do? And she sees me, and it's like, oh, JIRA, okay. I think we're going to use JIRA. But JIRA is not a portfolio management tool, and we couldn't do everything that we needed to do. We could do most of it, and you might find yourself in a similar circumstance where you're going to be asked to do some of these things, and maybe I can share some of the obstacles that we came across when we were working on this. Request qualification. We needed to make sure that the users were filling in multiple required fields so that there was a little bit of a barrier to entry for these larger scale project requests. Product and portfolio management, we had to make sure those people actually had specific permissions to move tickets along in the right space. Executive sign-off, we actually embedded a JIRA cookie and some validators and post functions within the workflow steps so that if it had passed through a certain stage, if it had a certain field filled in, then it would open up other workflow options. And a single source of truth. This became work that a couple of people I work with, who are sitting right there, worked on, but they compiled JIRA and Confluence together and began plucking out data so that you could see the status of these overall projects and in a one big large dashboard in Confluence. So it wasn't a matter of going to many JIRA dashboards or anything like that. Things we weren't able to tackle were things like time tracking and actual scenario tracking. There was a large rejection of time tracking within the people who worked, and they didn't want to take the political time to change management to do that. And then fundamentally, scenario tracking is still something that JIRA lacks, and it's still something we're looking at. But the idea, and you can get that with plugins, but the idea that moving scenarios around was something that we weren't quite able to do at that time. But still, we fulfilled their needs, and we gave them what they wanted. So when you speak with executives, these are things that you need to put in your mind. And if you find yourself in a political situation where you're going to speak with executives and you aren't quite sure how to approach it, these are 3 simple things that you can put in your mind. Know your audience, find out whatever you can, whether talking to them, talking to their peers. Figure out who they are and what they need. That's going to be your key to understanding their business challenges. Owning your data, if you have any data at all, if you have any numbers, if you have any cold, hard facts, not only figuring those things out, but being able to wrap the context and make it important to your audience. That's a really critical component of that as well. But most important, be able to tell a compelling story. Be able to give the ups and downs of how your users are using the technology and what sort of business value that you can add. And so you can create a picture in the mind of the executive as they begin to mull over how these tools can be used. I'll tell one last story. Right before last summit, so just about a year and a half ago, I had Scott Farquhar come to Symantec. He wanted to see our instance. He wanted to check out what we was doing. He was going around. And if I had had that happen a couple years previous, I don't think I would have known what to do. But by this time, I had engaged with enough executives that it was fairly easy for me to do that. And this is sort of where these ideas really came and crystallized in my mind. I know my audience. Well, he's the co-CEO and co-founder of one of my favorite companies. Why is he here? He wants to understand the experience. He wants to see what his users are using the tools. He wants to get a frontline view of how his company is doing. Okay, so he probably doesn't want to hear about how we're using workflow steps so much, but he wants the larger contextualized experience. As far as the data goes, he's looking at our Scrum boards. He wants to know how many users we have and whether things are working for us. There wasn't a lot of data to provide him, but there was some context around how the tools were being used that we could easily give him. And finally, telling a compelling story. I told a lot of the story that I told you here today in much greater detail. And our 45-minute meeting, scheduled 45-minute meeting, actually went to an hour and a half. And at the end, he was quite satisfied, and I went on my way. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks, that's really good. Lots of really good points in there. Again, we got about 8 minutes to do some Q&A, so if you guys have any questions for Dave or want to share any of the experiences that you guys had talking to your own executives, now's the time. So we got a couple mics floating around. Just raise your hand and we'll come find you.
You guys are all burnt out. I can tell. There's the
Everyone
beer.
just wants
The
a
beer
nap,
is somewhere
right?
over there.
Okay, question in the back. Eric will get you a mic.
So how did you end up solving some of the scenario planning pieces that you didn't go into detail on?
Jesper right here is laughing at me. We haven't. We're looking at Folio and a couple of other plugins right now. It's that question. The business has been changing so fast that question is still a really critical need for the business. For a while there, it wasn't as critical as some other things. You know how these needs, they kind of float in and out, and we solved most of their problems, and that sort of diminished, and now it's crept back up. And Jesper, my partner here, is actually working with Folio and see if we can integrate Folio to get that greater view. I also have been haranguing the Atlassian enterprise folks and telling them, you got to solve this problem. So
That's me.
We're moving from another tool to JIRA. How do you communicate success to executives? How do you say, here are the metrics, they show that we succeed?
yeah, that's always a tricky situation because the workflows and the enterprise, or the whole instance and the exchange is most successful when there are no problems, right? You know that you're successful when no one's bothering you and no one's complaining. So that's always a difficult thing to delineate that you are successful. I think that just going back to finding some data to contextualize, seeing how many teams are using it and for what. When we turned on the first workflow, within 3 months we had our first 1,000 issues. And And we had no one come back and say this doesn't work. I mean, we made changes in the end, but I think being able to delineate where you started from and where you are now, whether you're looking at issues or how much throughput you're getting, getting some actual user stories. Go talk to your Scrum teams. Don't have it come from you. It's not up to you to talk about how successful it are. You want to get your customers to talk about how successful that you are.
It would be more like user satisfaction, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm talking about some objective metrics. I don't
Exactly.
know, performance, whatever. What do you measure? How do you measure it?
How do you measure that? I think that if you could, you'd want to go and maybe do a survey up front before you turn the thing on, and then do a survey afterwards, so you get some sort of date, so you can see how time has changed, how things have changed over time. But I think just users and identifying what their problems have been and what their problems are now. I always use the phrase "change the story." Are your users, they had these problems before and now they have these problems, and hopefully those problems have changed over time. They can do much more. I guess I would just recommend finding a couple key users who are enjoying this experience, who have been along for the ride, whether Scrum Masters are always great people to reach out to try to get their insight on how their lives are better, and put some sort of metrics yourself around what sort of things are changing, how much work you're doing to maintain it. So, does that answer your question? Sort of? Yeah.
Probably along the same lines, but just tactically, what reporting tools are you using for executives, for some of these executive reports that you're doing?
We're not using anything special. What I've basically done, I had this as a slide. What I found was a really cool thing to do was to find a dashboard, to create a dashboard that actually tells a story within the dashboard. So the dashboard that we use for our own internal tools workflow, it starts with what did we do last week? Right? Here's everything that was closed within the last 7 days at the top. So that's what we've been working on and everything that we've succeeded. Here's a picture of everything that's open right now, and that's everything that's open now and who it's assigned to, and also the time, how long it's been, the time to resolve, right? How are we trending? Are we trending this way or are we trending this way? And at the end, what are the new requests that have come in? And I can sit down with my manager and I can say, okay, here's what we've been doing, and you can provide, again, trying to tell some sort of story where, okay, here's what we've been working on, here's what's currently in the pipeline, and here's what we're actively taking on in the next few days. That would be one avenue that I would take. Again, you may not want to make too complex of a dashboard. I've seen executives say, I just want one little filter result thing at the top. That's all, nothing else, and everything else is blank. So the other thing that I would work for, though, as far as a reporting tool is, there's always the option of going and finding someone who's really good at Excel and pulling some imports of the data and getting them into really clever charts. But I would just try to use the native stuff within the dashboards to try to give you an idea of how are the teams doing overall.
Yeah, I'll follow up with a quick plug on a couple of add-ons that might be good. So EasyBI have an integration that's pretty awesome for pulling a bunch of data out of JIRA and putting it into lots of reports. And also the folks from Arsenal have a new plugin called Data Plane, which adds a whole bunch of reporting that you can customize on top of JIRA. So there's lots of other add-ons out there that are available to help do a lot of that reporting within JIRA. So I know that both of those guys are on the floor down there. So we got time for probably one more, if anyone else has a quick one. All right.
All right.
So it sounds, there's kind of two approaches, right? There's the organic, you go among the troops, get some champions. It sounds like what you're saying you find more successful is, get executive buy-in on changes of that kind and use that to roll them out to the organization.
Well, we wouldn't have succeeded if we hadn't we had to set up our JIRA instance away from everybody else, and we didn't, it grew on its own for quite a while. What the challenge was, you can go in the grassroots, and if you have a stable enough environment where you can get, and people can be using the tool on their own, and that's great. The challenge comes is when a new executive comes in and they're either trying to accomplish something themselves, so they have a goal that they need to meet, whether it's turning on operations or portfolio management or whatever that aspect is, or if they don't like JIRA, right? Or they don't like tools, and they are not a fan of tools and process, and we're not really into that. Why aren't we just using email for these sorts of things? So getting that executive on your side, I mean, you have to do both. I mean, hopefully you get to do both, because being able to grow your JIRA instance in the corner is really great, because then you get the user adoption and everyone loves it. But there may be a time where you get called out into the light and people want to know, what are you doing over here? And hopefully, and I sort of breeze through it, but hopefully you can get them something that they like and they kind of go and leave you alone. Like I said, the measure of the success is if nothing's wrong, no one cares that you're there. So.
All right. Thank you, Dave.
All right.
Round
Thanks,
of applause
everybody.
for Dave, please.